Hello chess fans, today we are going to be starting a new series on the Dutch defense, and the variation that we will discuss today is called the Stonewall Dutch. So without wasting any time, let's begin. After d4, I don't know why it's not moving, after d4, f5, this is the beginning of the Dutch defense. So what is the idea of this pawn push to f5? What we are doing with this move is that we are controlling the e4 square, very similar to d5. However, we are doing it with a flank pawn instead of the center pawn, instead of the center d pawn. This has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. If e4 is ever played, when we capture, and let's assume white captures back somehow, we will be trading off the flank pawn for the center pawn, which is less valuable. So we're trading a less valuable pawn for the more valuable central pawn. The downside of this opening is that it sort of exposes the king, especially on this diagonal, and there are ways that white can take advantage of this. In some lines you will see it as well. It doesn't quite happen in the Stonewall variation, but for example in some bishop g5 lines it can definitely happen, even in some Staunton Gambit lines. We will discuss all of those in a separate video though. This is not the video for it. It will get a separate episode. So after d4 f5, there are two ways that white can set up, two structural ways. Let me clarify that. What white can do is play g3 and fianchetto the bishop, or white can do a standard development with knight to f3, get the bishop out, get this knight out to c3 or d2. It doesn't quite matter. Well, it matters, but it's very flexible, so it can get out both ways, and put the pawn on e3. So I like to categorize them into two different categories: the non-fianchetto setups without g3 and fianchetto setups with g3. So let's start with non-fianchetto setups and what happens in those. So here, let's say white plays knight to f3, we go knight f6, bishop to g5, e6, e3, d5, c4, and c6. So this right here, this pawn structure with the pawns being on f5, e6, d5, and c6 is the Stonewall structure. And it has its own pros and cons. The pros are the fact that we are controlling e4 immensely with these two pawns, and not allowing this pawn advance in the future. But the con is the fact that this square on e5 is extremely weak. So if the dark square bishops are traded off, a lot of times white can plant the knight on e5, and black might have a slightly worse position. So what are the white's plans here? White wants to play on this square, meaning that white wants to trade off the dark square bishops, reroute the knight to d3. So this knight has to get to d3 in a lot of lines. So this knight goes to d3 with some ideas with knight c3, knight e2, knight f4, knight d3, or in some other lines rerouting this way with knight going to a3, then c2, e1, and d3 from there. We will see those in a bit more detail shortly, but for now let's continue this variation that we're discussing. Let's say white plays knight to c3, we go bishop to e7, breaking the pin. White plays bishop d3, and here we play this move, well, we castle first, castles, and here we play this move knight to e4. Now this is one of the main ideas for black. Black wants to put the knight on this very strong e4 square. We're controlling it so many times, so let's just put the knight there, and white takes on e7, we take back with the queen. Now generally this trade is more beneficial for the white pieces, because look at the pawn structure, right? White has most of these central pawns on dark squares, while black has them on the light squares. Meaning that for black, this is the good bishop, and this bishop on c8 is the bad bishop, because it's blocked in by all of black's pawns. So this trade in theory should benefit the white pieces. However, when we are discussing this variation specifically, we need to keep making progress here somehow, right? So we need to accept this concession and then play around it. Alternatively, we can not allow that by playing moves like h6, bishop f4, and g5, for example, and then bishop goes back to g3. This is also playable. So if you're interested in this variation, you can play around with it, analyze it. I think this variation is also quite strong. You can put the knight on e4, put the other knight on d7, and try to start some sort of an attack on the king side. That is the main plan of this opening, if everything goes smoothly. Also, another detail that you need to understand is that if we play a move like knight d7, what white will do is white will make this capture on d5, and here we cannot capture with the e-pawn because this pawn is hanging. Generally, whenever you see c takes d5, you want to be able to recapture with the e-pawn. And when you play this knight d7 move, it blocks the bishop on this diagonal, even if it's temporary. And after a c takes d5, you're unable to capture with the e-pawn, so you have to capture with the c-pawn. And this is, it's worse for black for sure, but it is playable. I don't like it. I would not go for this structure. So if you can, you should avoid this kind of a scenario where you're forced to recapture the d5 pawn with the c pawn. So that's why knight d7 here is not my preferred move, and it's actually knight to e4. And after captures, white plays this maneuver with knight going to e2, and the idea is to go to f4. So as you can see, everything in this opening, and knight d7 is a move played by black, everything in this opening revolves around the dark squares. e5 square is weak, f4 square is also sort of weak, even though g5 can be played, but black has to be careful with g5 because it is actually a good move in this position specifically. After knight h5, g4, we get this sort of a position where white is definitely slightly better, but it is playable for both sides, and the position is super dynamic, and this is with perfect play. However, a lot of your opponents, they're not going to play perfectly. They're not going to know all the best ideas here, and one very interesting way that you can get an advantage is, let's say if your opponents, well, let me go back to this position right here. If instead of knight e2, knight f4, let's say your opponents play a move like queen e2, which looks like a normal developing move, preparing rook c1 and then rook d1 to finish development. Here you continue with knight d7, you play g5, you play g4, and you just start pushing these pawns on the king side. So this is a very aggressive opening, as you can see. And if white ever captures the knight on e4, this is extremely dangerous, because after f takes e4, now the rook is open, and you have various attacking ideas as well. After, let's say, a move like g3, trying to reactivate this knight on g2 and f4, we play knight f6, and I made arrows here, so you can see all the attacking plans that can happen in this position. You can reroute this knight to h7 and g5 to take control of these weak light squares here, or you can also play moves like rook to f7, bringing this rook to h7 or g7, and then playing h4 and opening up the h file. So this is also a very interesting attacking plan. So that's what happens if your opponent misplays the position. So that's the e3 system in a nutshell, or non-fianchetto setup in a nutshell. That is what you want to do. Of course, there are other ways white can play. For example, white doesn't have to put the bishop on d3. What happens if the white puts the bishop on e2, for example, like going all the way back, right? Bishop e2. I mean, some of these moves are just simply inferior versions of the other moves. There's no good reason for white to put the bishop on e2 rather than d3. It's actually hindering white if it's on e2 because this maneuver of knight e2 and knight f4 is not possible. Same goes with the development of this knight. There are some lines where the knight goes to d2 in some positions. However, that mostly happens in the fianchetto setups. In these setups, the knight should really go to c3 and not on e2 for the white pieces. Now, for your development, as I already mentioned, this knight goes to e4. Well, don't blunder your queen, obviously. But this knight, in terms of ideas, it goes to e4. This knight goes to d7, f6. Bishop will be developed to either e7 or d6. And this bishop has two ways to develop. It can either, let me just fast forward here a little bit. So let's say here, it can either go this way with bishop d7, bishop e8, and bishop to h5. Very strong developing plan, by the way. Pretty cool as well. You don't get to see this maneuver often in chess. It's a rare maneuver. In Stonewall it happens all the time, but in other openings it does not. Or you can play b6 and get the bishop out to either b7 or a6 in a lot of positions. However, in this instance, I don't think it's as good. I think it's better to just go this way. So you're flexible in terms of your development as well. You can play knight d7 here, immediately controlling e5, or you can start with bishop d7 as well. These are both equally as good as each other, in my opinion. So that is the non-fianchetto setup. Now let's move on to the fianchetto setup. So let me quickly open up a new chapter. Oh, actually it is lagging, so let me refresh the page really quickly. Yeah, there we go. Let me just make sure it's recording. Yes, it is. Okay, so the moves in the beginning are the same, d4, f5, but here what white does is, instead of playing moves like knight f3 and bishop, well, knight f3 will be played, but instead of developing the bishop to g5, white waits with this bishop and instead develops the light square bishop to g2. This is the most played line, so you can say that this is the main line of the Stonewall. White plays bishop g2, black plays e6, knight to f3, d5, castles, and c6. So once again, we get this structure, the Stonewall structure. The pawns are like this. White plays c4, and here black plays bishop to d6. Now here, there's a major question that we should ask ourselves. Do we develop the bishop to e7 or do we develop it to d6? And now let me tell you, developing it to d6 is definitely better than developing it to e7. Why? Because there's a specific idea in this position. After b3, let's say white castles, which is not the most precise move. Black castles, what white can play is this idea of bishop to a3. So black does not want to trade off the dark square bishops, as I said, but white wants to trade these bishops off. And here in this position, white is achieving that very successfully. That is why in this position, we don't actually castle. We start with queen to e7, which stops this bishop a3 idea. And going further back, that is also why we don't develop the bishop to e7, because here bishop a3 can be played in the same way. And after bishop a3, if black takes here on a3, which is also not good, knight ends up on a3, and basically here white does this maneuver that I was talking about earlier, where the knight from a3 goes to c2, e1, and d3. So let me just show you this line. Let's say queen e7, knight c2, knight d7, knight to e1, knight d4, knight d3, and the knight on f3 and d3 are very well placed. The f knight is ready to jump into e5, and the position is slightly better for the white pieces. Now going back, that is why we want to avoid all of that, and we want to put the bishop on d6 instead. After b3, bishop to queen to e7, bishop to b2, castles, And then here there are many ways to play this position. The main line is queen c1, once again preparing this bishop a3 maneuver, and this cannot be stopped. You just have to continue developing here and accept the fact that the dark square bishops are going to be traded off if a white plays queen c1. You just continue, accomplishing your plan with knight to e4, takes, and there's some lines with queen to a3. There are some other lines where white can bring this queen from a3 to f4, which is another plan, and basically white is very slightly better in these positions. But you have to keep in mind that Dutch defense is not exactly the most precise opening at the computer level. So if your opponent plays all the best moves, you might get a slightly worse position. However, that doesn't mean you should not play it. It's actually super positionally rich, and I think it is a good practical weapon, especially in blitz, but also if you want to play it in longer time controls, you can. Your opponents, especially if your opponents are not prepared, this can be a very effective weapon. So going back, instead of queen c1, I want to discuss one or two more lines. So instead of instead of b3 actually, what happens if white plays this very cool idea, bishop to f4. This aims to trade the dark square bishops off immediately, and if we castle, white accomplishes that, but we want to get something in return when we make this exchange. So in this case, that is why we take the bishop on f4 and double our opponent's pawns. Now this works both ways. You could argue that the doubled pawns are bad for white, so black is doing well. But you can also argue that white can go king h1, rook g1, and attack on the g file, and that benefits white, right? The g file opened up when this capture happened. However, I don't particularly think that this g file attack is that dangerous. I think it is not as difficult to deal with this as you might maybe think, if you think that it's dangerous. So here black castles, white plays e3, knight to e4, knight to e5, knight d7, and here f3, and we go into this line. Let's say knight to d6, c5, knight f7, and we go into this position where white still has these doubled f pawns. The squares on e4 and g4 are controlled by the f pawn, which is quite well placed. This pawn is also very useful controlling these two squares. However, it is difficult for white to get this knight to e5. White has to do lots of maneuvering here, like for example d2, b3, c1, d3, e5. That's like 5 moves to get to this square, and even if you get there, it's just going to be traded off. So in my opinion here, black is totally equal, and I don't see any danger with this bishop to f4 line. But regardless, it is something that I should mention, and it is something that you should be aware of. So another detail that I want to mention before I finish this video is if white just simply continues with moves like a knight c3 or knight to d2, here you continue with your plans with castles, and then let's say queen to c2, you put the knight on e4, and you continue playing in your fashion. Go knight d7, knight to f6, and you continue this way. In these lines, it's quite difficult to accomplish a kingside attack. However, it is something that you can go for regardless if your opponent does not play well. For example, let's say like moves like e3, knight to d7, knight e2, knight to, no, not f6 here. But you can even consider moves like b6, developing the bishop this way, and continue playing the game. So I would say don't try to force the attack in this position, because if it's a fianchetto structure, it is going to be a bit more difficult to attack this. So don't force it, just think about development, and you will surely get an equal position or maybe even better position sometimes. But if you even if you get an equal position in the Dutch defense, that's already somewhat good, because the position starts off as being worse, right? Dutch defense is not the most accurate opening in the world. However, practically, if you're able to equalize the game from with the Dutch defense, you're doing very well, because your opponent has already made an inaccuracy, so he's already out of his preparation. He already doesn't know all the ideas, so that is an advantage for you. So that is it for the Stonewall variation. The next ones I'm going to discuss, I guess, classical and the Leningrad variations as well. I think both of those are super interesting with super unique ideas. If you like the video, please like, share and subscribe. We're trying to grow the channel here. I want you to be part of that journey. So without wasting any more time, you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.